The government has summoned China's ambassador as it considers expelling diplomats linked to an alleged threat against Conservative MP Michael Chong and his family. Chong found out about that threat in the Globe and Mail this week, 2 years after CSIS wrote a report about it. He's been pressing to find out who else in government knew about it and for how long. Today, he finally got some answers.
July 20th, 2021, did your department receive this intelligence assessment?
I was not the Minister for Foreign Affairs. I
understand that, but I'm asking if your department received it.
Yes.
You were appointed minister on October 26th, several months later. I assume that your department received it. The Prime Minister indicated yesterday that that assessment never left CSIS. It seems inexplicable that it would not have left CSIS. Mr. Speaker, I've just been informed by the National Security Advisor that the CSIS intelligence assessment of July 20th, 2021 was sent by CSIS to the relevant departments and to the National Security Advisor in the PCO.
As the Prime Minister said, and I said earlier this week, that we found out on Monday of this week.
Okay, all of this as the Liberals kick off their party convention in Ottawa to reset and reflect on the last decade under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Dominic LeBlanc is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and he joins us now from the Liberal convention floor. Minister, thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening, David. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Minister. All right, well, I got to pivot off of that. I want to start with today's news on the changing stories of who knew what about the threats against Michael Chong's family. Because yesterday, the Prime Minister said CSIS never briefed, the Prime Minister's office never briefed any departments. But today, we've got Jody Thomas, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, calling Michael Chong to say that this intelligence report went to the Privy Council office and to other departments. What exactly is going on here?
Well, David, obviously what happened to Mr. Chong, the threats or the attempt to intimidate or threaten his family, totally unacceptable. Those are the exact kind of actions that our government has to counter in a very aggressive and firm way. One of the challenges is within the intelligence community, how these reports are shared, how this information is shared, and what the appropriate follow-up has been. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety have directed the intelligence agencies to ensure that any such information is immediately shared with the Minister in a way that is actionable, that the Minister will be in a position to ensure that the appropriate follow-ups are taken. So we'll continue to do what's necessary, David, as a national government, to ensure that this kind of activity alleged and perpetrated by the Chinese regime is countered in the most forceful terms.
But Minister, there's a serious breakdown either in communication or of understanding or of briefing for this report to have been sent to the Privy Council office, which is the department that serves the Prime Minister's office, and for the Prime Minister to emphatically say yesterday it hadn't happened, and today he has to be contradicted by his National Security and Intelligence Advisor. I mean, how should Canadians and parliamentarians view all that?
Well, they should understand that we take these allegations and these circumstances extremely seriously. And we have, as a government, the Prime Minister himself, my colleague, the Public Safety Minister, I've been participating in meetings this week where we have been asking those very intelligence agencies those kind of questions. What do we need to have as a national government to reassure parliamentarians and Canadians that everything that has to be done is being done, and that information regarding the potential threat on parliamentarians or an attempt to intimidate parliamentarians in a way that's illegal under Canadian law is met with all of the forceful measures that are necessary.
But I'm having a hard time understanding how the story can change so dramatically in 24 hours. That Michael Chong was brought into the Prime Minister's office and told that, you know, this never made it here. The Prime Minister's office didn't know. They only found out about it on Monday, and now we find out today that, in fact, a couple of years ago, this intelligence report was sent up the chain and made it all the way to the National Security Advisor of the Prime Minister.
And David, so we understand and accept the frustration that Canadians have around these attempts to interfere in Canadian democracy and the freedom of parliamentarians to do their work. Our government has put in place a series of measures that we're looking to strengthen all the time. We're looking at what needs to be done internally in terms of the sharing of intelligence information, the appropriate people to action whatever is necessary following this information. So we'll continue to do what is necessary and make the improvements necessary to ensure that what happened to Mr. Chong never happens again, and those that seek to perpetrate that kind of activity are held to account.
Well, one of the things the opposition and the Conservatives and the New Democrats say is necessary is the expulsion of some Chinese diplomats. Minister Joly, at committee today, said that the government was assessing the consequences of that. I mean, what will it take for this government to expel a diplomat if the body of evidence we've seen on China to this point hasn't already led to this?
But David, my colleague has said that all of those options are on the table. These aren't decisions that a country makes lightly. They're obviously met with reprisals from a country like China. But I think Canadians should have confidence that we're going to take all the steps that are appropriate, including examining that very step of expulsing, kicking out diplomats that engage in this completely unacceptable activity. So,
do you think you're at the point where this absolutely has to happen in terms of the relationship with China, given these latest revelations?
I think it's important that the Foreign Affairs Minister do the work that's necessary, the due diligence, and I'm very certain that she'll take the appropriate measures quickly.
Okay, on the convention that you are attending over the next several days that's being held here in Ottawa, the national polls would suggest the Liberals are slightly behind the Conservatives when you look at the aggregate, but certainly on fundraising, the Conservatives have a really big lead, out-fundraising you by millions of dollars in the first quarter of this year. How concerned is the Liberal Party about that dynamic going into this convention?
Well, David, the Conservative Party has always had impressive fundraising numbers. What's interesting is to look at what percentage they pay in terms of the cost of raising that money. I'm not sure all that money is net to the Conservative Party. Our fundraising is going very well. We've had record quarters ourselves last year. The convention itself will bring together 4,000 Liberals from across the country. It's the first time in 5 years we've had a chance to have an in-person event like this. There have been over 300 policy resolutions debated at different meetings across the country. 36 of them will be discussed here. It's a full program. People are excited to be here. I'm excited to see people from across the country that we haven't had a chance to see in many years. The mood is good. The attendance is high. 45%, David, of the people coming to this convention, it's the first time they've come to an in-person Liberal convention like this. So that augurs very well in terms of the renewal of our party as well.
This is likely the last big gathering before the next election, presumably, based on where things are. You'll be seeking a fourth term by the time we go to the polls. Where is the room for growth for the Liberals right now? Because we've seen, according to a lot of the public opinion polling, a decline in the accessible pool of voters available to the Liberals. So how do you look to grow after being in office now since 2015?
I think that we continue to talk about the issues that matter to Canadians. We continue to focus on the issues that people talk to us about in our constituencies, that Liberals who are coming to this convention in the next few days want to talk about. Affordability issues, the fight against climate change, protecting women's reproductive rights. Unlike the Conservatives, David, the policy resolutions we're going to look at aren't going to debate whether climate change is real, whether we should have done more to support the convoy, whether we should seek to restrict women's reproductive rights. We're very, very much focused as a government and as a party on issues that resonate with Canadians. That's the work that they expect their elected representatives to do. We think that will continue to resonate with Canadians. And we're very confident that when the next election comes, people will have a real contrast between what we're working on, what we stand for, the values that we're articulating, and what Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives are talking about. So I'm not pessimistic at all. We're some months, if not years, away from a potential election. David, you've been around a long time. Polls move up and down. What's important for us is to remain focused on what matters to Canadians. That's the work we do as a parliamentary caucus, as a cabinet, and that's what the Liberals that are here in Ottawa over the next few days want to talk to us about and talk to each other about.
The issues you outlined have sort of been the menu of issues that you've run on since 2015. But I wonder, given where this conversation started, the challenges around China and sort of the confusing sort of performance this week from the government, how much do you think fatigue and competence become a challenge for you going ahead?
Well, I mean, look, we understand that the country has been through a difficult few years, the pandemic, the economic circumstances, and considerably exacerbated by the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a global economic moment that's very difficult. So Canadians are understandably concerned about that. Our government is focused on that. You know, on election day, David, people will have, when the election comes, a real choice. It'll be a choice between two very different alternatives in terms of the Conservative and the Liberal Party's ideas, the leadership experience that our Prime Minister has. I'm not pessimistic at all. I'm enthusiastic. I think we have shown Canadians over the last 7.5 years that we're focused on things that matter for them, and we'll continue to do that. And then Canadians will choose when the next election comes if they want to have a government focused on the future, dealing with things that matter to them, or a government that wants to rewind some 1950s or 60s debates and focus on things that frankly don't improve the lives of people in our communities.
Dominic LeBlanc, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, David, and happy birthday again.
The government has summoned China's ambassador while it considers how to respond to an alleged threat against Conservative MP Michael Chong. Chong, whose family was reportedly targeted by a Chinese diplomat, has been pushing for that diplomat to be expelled. Here's some of a heated exchange between Michael Chong and Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly at committee this morning.
Why is this diplomat still here?
You've asked me questions regarding foreign interference in the past. I've always said that, of course, we would never tolerate any. And second, we would make sure that, you know, if there was any violation of the Vienna Convention, we would take action.
Minister, Article 9 of the Vienna Convention is clear.
I will just, if I can.
I've heard your answer. It's
no, but I'm not finished.
You have given accreditation to a diplomat here who is using his diplomatic immunity to target not just me and my family, but other members of Parliament. So why do you, Minister, continue to allow this diplomat to be accredited in this country on Canadian soil? That is the question. And you haven't answered the question.
We're assessing the consequences that we'll be facing in case of diplomatic expulsion, because there will be consequences. Economic interests, consular interests, and also diplomatic interests will be
Minister, I can't think of any
affected,
interest.
and therefore, no,
Minister,
Michael, I just want to finish my answer because this is very important. It's about you, but it's about also the interests of the country. So, as we are assessing the interest, and I know that we are under pressure to go fast, we need to make sure as well that we protect our democracy. My deputy minister right now is meeting with the Chinese ambassador and summoning him, and that's why also we're assessing different options, including the expulsion of diplomats, because it is important that we take a decision.
I would hope that the deputy minister is informing the ambassador that this individual, Mr. Wei Zhou, should be on the first plane out or declared persona non grata. And I think that that is the only course of action here, because if we do not take that course of action, Minister, we are basically putting up a giant billboard for all authoritarian states around the world that says we are open for foreign interference threat activities on Canadian soil, targeting Canadian citizens, and you can conduct these activities with zero consequences. And that's why this individual needs to be sent packing.
So
Mr. Chair, a question about...
I share your concern regarding foreign interference. I share your concern regarding the message we would be sending. I think in order for this country to be safe and prosper, of course, democracy must be at, our bedrock. That being said, we will take a decision thoughtfully. We will take a decision that will have the best interests of Canadians and our democracy in mind. But as I mentioned, all options are on the table.
Okay, for more on this story, we're joined by Guy Saint-Jacques, who served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016, and Dennis Horak, who served as Canada's ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2015 to 2018. And Mr. Horak was expelled from Saudi Arabia during a diplomatic fight between the kingdom and then Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Guy, I'd like to start with you if I could. The Foreign Affairs Minister says the government is assessing different options, including the expulsion of diplomats. Based on what we know now, is that the best, perhaps only path forward?
Well, I'm surprised that this assessment did not take place much earlier because, in fact, what we have learned in recent months is that China is and has been conducting various interference activities in Canada. And if there's no action taken by the government, I think this means to the Chinese government, you can go ahead and continue. I think that probably the message that was given this morning by Deputy Minister Morrison to the Chinese ambassador was to tell him either you withdraw voluntarily your diplomat, or else we will expel him. But at some point, you have to put your foot down and you have to take action.
Mr. Horak, do you agree with that assessment? Is it now incumbent upon the government, do you think, to expel this diplomat?
I do agree with Guy. I think, certainly I'm a little bit surprised that they're only doing the assessment now and the implications because presumably or seemingly this story is a couple of years old at this point, and I think that's something that should have been considered a while ago. Absolutely, based on the information that we have publicly, I don't see how we can continue to operate here. Whether it's a voluntary withdrawal or an expulsion remains to be seen, but I think certainly an expulsion would set a much stronger message. Although obviously the implications, the repercussions of that would also be much stricter.
Well, Guy, just walk us through that. I mean, how do you think Beijing would react if Canada does expel a diplomat?
Well, I think they will want to expel one of our own. And since Mr. Jacques is located in a consulate, I think they will look at one of our consulates in China, either in Shanghai, Chongqing, Guangzhou, or Hong Kong. The problem, of course, this will create for us is that our diplomats are engaged in real work, whether it's on the immigration side, consular, or trade promotion. While on the Chinese side, we know that a good number of Chinese diplomats are in fact doing other things than consular or diplomatic work. But this being said, I think we'll have to live with the consequences. Maybe what Mrs. Joly is concerned about is possible repercussions for the 3 Canadians that are on death row in China. 2 of them have been condemned for drug trafficking. In the past, the Chinese have been adamant. They have a zero tolerance policy for such a crime. And in fact, now they may proceed. But there's also the third case, which is of Robert Schellenberg. You will recall that Mr. Schellenberg had been sentenced to, I think, something like 15 years in jail. He appealed, and then right after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the Chinese came up supposedly with new evidence. They organized a quick trial and rendered a death sentence. He has appealed, but he is still waiting for a decision. So that might be a concern for Mrs. Joly.
Dennis, what are your sense of the consequences that Canada is bracing for here, and what will be the consequences of a reduced diplomatic footprint in China if that's where this goes?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly something that we have to consider, and I think he's right. I think the normal response would be to respond in kind. That if we send a consular official out, that they would send a consular official out from us. But with China, I think at this stage is very unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, these are all considerations we have to take into account. But we also have to take into account the repercussions of not doing anything. That also sends a message. And there are other countries. One I'm very familiar with, Iran, for example, which does mess around in diaspora communities here. And the message is, if we just let this go, because we're afraid of the repercussions, that sends a very strong message to other countries. So, you know what, Canada is a bit of an open season here, or an open playing field. And that's a consideration we have to take into account as well.
So, Guy, I want to ask about the CSIS intelligence that's at the heart of all of this. It's been a very confusing story and a changing story, quite frankly, as to who had access to this intelligence and where it was sent. We learned today from Michael Chong, who got a call from the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister telling him that the story had changed. That while the Prime Minister had said this week, CSIS never briefed it up the chain. Jody Thomas now calls Michael Chong and says it actually came to the Privy Council office and it went to other departments. What's your assessment of all of this confusion and lack of understanding here?
Well, I think there has been. I'm not sure if we can call this confusion or just complacency or lack of action. But in this case, I'm a bit surprised that this did not go to the Prime Minister, because this is a serious offense. And it came at the time when we knew already that the Chinese had been messing up with the electoral system in Canada. We knew that they were trying to influence some members of Parliament, some members of the Senate. And therefore, this should have triggered a reaction right away, and I think the Prime Minister should have been advised. Apart from this case, it's clear that there's a lot of frustration among CSIS on the lack of action after all the reports that they have sent up in the chain of command without any evident action so far.
You know, Dennis, the intelligence assessment that was obtained by the Globe and Mail says that the Chinese diplomat was playing a role in finding out if Michael Chong had any family over there that they could target for possible sanctions, was the language that was used. And according to what the Prime Minister said this week, it wasn't deemed a serious enough threat to brief it up the chain, though that kind of changed today. At this point in time, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were still in Chinese custody, right? So like in 2021, I mean, how could they make an assessment that family members being targeted for sanctions wasn't a serious enough threat given what was actually happening between Canada and China at that point in time?
Yeah, I don't know that either. It is strange to me. You know, certainly, you know, we always look at intelligence, and you have to have assessed intelligence. You know, in and of itself, a small piece of intelligence may or may not be significant, but certainly these, from what I understand, that this intelligence was assessed, and whatever credibility was attached to it. Certainly, if you get intelligence that an MP or his family is being targeted, whatever your normal threshold is, that's a higher stakes ball game, I think, in my view, and there's no way it should have been kept back. The fact that the two Michaels were still detained would perhaps explain why they didn't want to act at that particular time until they were released. I could get a short delay while they were still detained. Once they were released, and I do accept that there were other cases as well, but you can't let your policy, you can't let your threshold be determined by another country's decision to detain Canadians, because that's an invitation. Well, okay, we can do whatever we want. We'll just detain some Canadians, and that'll stop them from doing anything. Again, that's another invitation to do more things, to detain more Canadians, to interfere as and when we want to. These are hard decisions by government. I get that, but when it comes to interfering with the mechanisms of democracy, our threshold for intervention's got to be pretty low.
Guy Saint-Jacques, just a final question for you. Having been in China and knowing China the way you do, what do you take it to mean when they say that they were targeting family members? I mean, how serious do you take that phrase, and what do you understand that to mean?
Well, it's very serious. It's a pattern that EU is used all the time, especially against members of the Chinese diaspora. I have good friends in the diaspora who tell me they like what I say publicly, but they are handcuffed. They feel they cannot say anything, and the reason is they still have family in China. And they said if we were to say anything critical on China, we know that our family members could be detained. In fact, their child could lose access to to school. And the Chinese regime can be quite brutal. I know that people have been, the family members have been put in jail because of some comments that were made at this end. And so it's a systematic system to ensure that nobody will express any critical comments on China. But the fact that they are now doing this to members of parliament require a higher level of response on our part.
Okay, Dennis Horak, Guy Saint-Jacques, I'd like to thank you both for your time. Appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks
for having me.